All right, please open to the book of Revelation, chapter 17. And so we have today and then next week, we will complete looking at every verse in the Bible where we find the word mystery or mysteries. So the one that we will look at tonight is the 26th time that we find those words in the Bible. And of the 26, 20 of them were in Paul's epistles. And so the one that we will look at today is in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 5. And again, we will look at the context a bit here. And so let's begin reading in Revelation chapter 17, verse 1. And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither. I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. And then beginning with verse 3, we will look at it a little more carefully. So verse 3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. So first of all, the he at the beginning of verse 3, where it says, so he carried me away. The he who carried him away in the spirit in the wilderness is the angel mentioned in verse 1, in chapter 17 and verse 1. And that phrase in verse 3, he carried me away into this in the spirit, that would remind us of something earlier in the book of Revelation. So if you go back to chapter 1 for a moment, Revelation chapter 1, and Jean Gross, would you read verse 10?
Revelation 1:10. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and heard behind me a great voice as of a trumpet.
Okay, so John says here, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day. Now, notice that in chapter 1, verse 10, the word Spirit is capitalized. So it's referring to the Holy Spirit. But in chapter 17 and verse 3, the word Spirit is not capitalized. And so in chapter 17, verse 3, that's referring to John's spirit. So all humans are made up of spirit, soul, and body. And so that's referring to John's spirit in chapter 17 and verse 3. But we know from chapter 1 and verse 10 that John's spirit was in the Holy Spirit in this book to see and to hear things in heaven and things yet future. So the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, communicates with us through our spirit. And so one of the things that this tells us is that in the book of Revelation, John did not bodily go into heaven, or he did not bodily see these future things, but rather his spirit was taken into heaven, and in his spirit he saw these things. Look in chapter 4. So, for example, we know in 2 Corinthians 12, we won't turn there now, but in 2 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about going into the third heaven. And he says that he didn't really know if he was in the body or not. But in the case of the book of Revelation, it's clear that John was not in the body. All right, Revelation chapter 4. And RJ, would you read verse 2?
Verse 2. So Revelation 4, verse 2. And immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne.
Okay, so he says, I was in the Spirit. And again, notice that that's referring to John's spirit, not the Holy Spirit. And he sees a throne set in heaven and one that sat on the throne. And then one more in chapter 21 in the book of Revelation. chapter 21, and Richard, would you read verse 10?
(21:10). And he carried me away in the spirit to a great and high mountain, and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God.
All right, so notice again, he carried me away in the spirit. So not in the body, but in the spirit, and showed me that great city, so forth. All right, then back to chapter 17 in the book of Revelation. And again, looking in verse 3, it says, the angel carried John into the wilderness. Now, this also has been mentioned earlier in the book of Revelation. If you look back in chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12, and Han Hui, would you read verse 6?
Revelations 12, verse 6. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days.
Okay, so notice the woman fled into the wilderness. And then again in Revelation chapter 12, Dennis, would you read verse 14?
Did you say Revelation 12:14?
Correct.
All right. And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and a half a time from the face of the serpent.
Okay, so here again in verse 14, it mentions a woman, and she flies into the wilderness. So again, the wilderness has been mentioned prior to in chapter 17, back here in chapter 12. So the woman in these verses in chapter 12 is referring to the little flock or the remnant in the nation of Israel. But then if you go back to chapter 17, in chapter 17 and verse 3, John goes on and says, and I saw a woman upon a scarlet colored beast. So this is not the same woman as back in chapter 12. This is a different woman. And we will read more about this woman in chapter 17 and verse 3 as we move along in the passage. But if, for example, if you go back to the book of Proverbs, you find in the book of Proverbs, there are 2 women spoken of. One is a wisdom woman, and the other is a harlot or a strange woman. And so here also in the book of Revelation, you have these 2 women, one being the little flock or remnant of believers in the nation of Israel, back in chapter 12. And then here in chapter 17, you have this woman that he sees sit upon a scarlet colored beast. And so this is getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but it's not until we come to the end of chapter 17 that we learn regarding this woman. In chapter 17, would Dan or Laura read verse 18, the last verse?
17:18, and the woman which thou sawest is that great city which reigneth over the kings of the earth.
Okay, so it's not until we come to the end of this chapter that we learn that the woman spoken of in this chapter is that great city. And this great city also has previously been spoken of. If you turn back to chapter 14 in Revelation, chapter 14, and Dick, would you read verse 8?
Okay, you said 14:8.
Yes.
Okay. 14:8. And there followed another angel saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication.
Okay, so we learn back here in chapter 14 and verse 8 that great city is Babylon. And then look in chapter 16. Chapter 16, and Meg, would you read verse 19? Are you there, Meg?
Sorry.
Okay.
I read the whole verse.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now, was it 17?
Chapter 16 and verse 19.
19, okay. And the great city was divided into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon came into remembrance before God, to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath.
Okay, so before coming to chapter 17, again, we learned back in chapter 14, the verse that Dick just read, that great city is Babylon. And then we also learn here in chapter 16 and verse 19 that the great city and great Babylon will be given the cup of the wine of the fierceness of the wrath. So clearly Babylon is going to face severe judgment from the wrath of God. And so we know that Babylon, the woman in chapter 17, that great city, Babylon, clearly we know that's a negative thing because it's going to face the wrath of God. So we will seek to more specifically identify this woman or that great city as we move along in chapter 17. And I should mention that the final place in the Bible where we find the word mystery is also in Revelation chapter 17. So some of these things we will be speaking about more next time. All right, then back in chapter 17. And again in verse 3, it says, the woman is sitting upon a scarlet colored beast. The color scarlet in the Bible is associated with kings or royalty. And one way we easily can see this is turn to Matthew chapter 27. Matthew chapter 27, and would Dan or Lisa read verses 27 to 29? So Matthew chapter 27 and verses 27 to 29.
27 to 29. One more page. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the common hall and gathered unto him the whole band of soldiers. They stripped him and put him on a scarlet robe.
And then also 29.
Oh, 29. And when they had plaited a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of Jews.
Okay, so clearly in this passage, they're mocking Jesus as being the King of the Jews. And in mocking him for being the King of the Jews, in verse 28, they put on him a scarlet robe. So this is one of the places we see clearly the color scarlet in the Bible is associated with being a king or with royalty. And so it's often taught, go back to Revelation chapter 17 and look again at verse 3. It's often taught that the woman in this chapter is scarlet colored, but notice in verse 3 that verse 3 says that the beast is scarlet colored. And so this scarlet colored beast will also be described more, a bit more in more detail later in the chapter. So we will look at that more as we go on. But I want to note it at this point in verse 3. Again, it's the beast here who is scarlet colored. And also note in verse 3 that the woman is sitting upon the scarlet colored beast. So that the woman here is supported by the beast. All right, then also in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 3, it says the beast is full of names of blasphemy. Now, we already, a few weeks ago, we spent, actually two weeks, we spent looking in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 regarding the mystery of iniquity. So we know that the beast here in verse 3 is the Antichrist. And we've discussed that in the middle of the 7 years, he will be empowered by Satan, and that's when he becomes the beast. Look back in chapter 13 in the book of Revelation. Chapter 13, and would Tim or Jean read verse 1?
Revelation 13, verse 1. And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy.
Okay, so this verse also speaks about this beast, and it says, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And then also in chapter 13, would Bonsinger Joyce read verse 5? Chapter 13, verse 5.
And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months.
So in here, the beast, there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. So when we come to chapter 17 and verse 3 and read that the beast is full of names of blasphemy, we already know some things about that. And then finally, back in chapter 17 and verse 3, it says that the beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. If you look back in chapter 13 again, and a moment ago, Tim read chapter 13 and verse 1, and I highlighted the end of the verse, upon his heads the name of blasphemy. But also, if you look again at chapter 13 and verse 1, it says having 7 heads and 10 horns. So that also is mentioned back here in chapter 13. And then also, if you look one chapter before that, Revelation chapter 12, and Akun, if you are able to read, would you read Revelation chapter 12 and verse 3?
Revelation 12:3. And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head.
Okay, so here in chapter 12, it's stated that a great red dragon had 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his heads. And we easily can identify who is this great red dragon, if we don't already know, because in Revelation chapter 12 again, Dominic, would you read verse 9? Revelation chapter 12 and verse 9.
Well, verse 9, and the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him.
So we don't have to wonder who is this great red dragon. We're plainly told here in the same chapter that the great red dragon is Satan. And so again, we will seek to identify who are these 7 heads and 10 horns as we proceed. All right, then back in chapter 17 and verse 4. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. So in verse 4, and the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color. So we saw in verse 3 that the beast was scarlet colored. Now in verse 4, the woman is arrayed in scarlet and purple. So we've already seen that scarlet in the Bible is associated with being a king or with royalty. The same is true with the color purple. And we could look at a few verses, but we'll just look at one. Back in the book of Judges, chapter 8. Judges chapter 8, and I will read verse 26. So Judges chapter 8, verse 26. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside ornaments and collars and purple raiment that was on the kings of Midian, and beside the chains that were about their camels' necks. So here you have some kings of Midian, and their raiment is, we are told that their raiment was purple. And there are other verses also we could look at, but that's one place where we see that the color purple in the Bible is also associated with being a king or with royalty. So both the woman and the beast in Revelation chapter 17 are associated with royalty. Okay, then back in Revelation chapter 17 and in verse 4, once again, we see that the woman is also decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. And once again, gold is associated with kings in the Bible. And of course, gold also has to do with wealth, as is the case in verse 4 with precious stones and pearls. All right, then in Revelation 17:4, the woman has a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. So the evil nature, we've already seen that this woman is going to suffer the wrath of God. And the evil nature of the woman is clear in verse 4 with the word abominations and filthiness and fornication. So that's why earlier we read Revelation chapter 14 and verse 8, where it tells us that Babylon will fall. And that's why Babylon will fall and will suffer the wrath of God, because she's full of abominations and filthiness and fornication. Now, the word abominations in the Bible often has to do with idolatry. And we'll just look at a couple examples of that. Turn back to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 18. Deuteronomy chapter 18, and Jean Gross, would you read verse 9?
Deuteronomy 18:9. When thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of those nations.
Okay, so here it speaks about the abominations of those nations, and clearly it's talking about the idolatry in those nations, that God is warning Israel not to partake in the idolatry, the abominations of those nations. And then one more here in Deuteronomy in chapter 29. Deuteronomy chapter 29, and RJ, would you read verse 17?
What verse again?
Deuteronomy chapter 29 and verse 17.
Verse 17. 17. And ye have seen their abominations and their idols, wood and stone, silver and gold, which were among them.
So ye have seen their abominations and their idols. And again, we could look at a number of verses and see that the word abomination or abominations in the Bible often has to do with idolatry. If you remember back when we were in 2 Thessalonians 2, we talked about the abomination of desolation. And that also is connected with idolatry. Okay, then go back again to Revelation chapter 17. Actually, before we do that, turn to Jeremiah, and then we'll go back to Revelation. Jeremiah chapter 51. Jeremiah chapter 51, and Richard, would you read verse 7?
Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand, and made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad.
So first of all, you see, obviously, we can better understand the Babylon in the book of Revelation by studying back here in Jeremiah. Because clearly, just reading verse 7, you can see this is the same thing spoken of in the book of Revelation. So Babylon has a golden cup and made all the earth drunken. And it says the nations have drunken of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. So back here also again, Babylon hath a golden cup in the Lord's hand. So go back then to Revelation 17. So clearly Babylon is wicked, but also one of the things we see in this verse in Jeremiah 51 that Richard just read is that Babylon, although again being clearly wicked, it is used by God to expose the nature and the desires of mankind. And so if you notice in the verse that Richard just read, it says, Babylon hath been a golden cup in the Lord's hand. So God is going to use, although again, Babylon is evil, God is going to use Babylon to expose the wickedness of mankind as she makes all the earth drunken. Okay, then back in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 5. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And you notice that in the King James, this is all in uppercase letters. This almost all of verse 5, this entire name in verse 5 is all in uppercase letters. And that's, if you remember when we talked about 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we also saw an example there. The reason why this is all uppercase in the King James is because at this point, the beast is claiming to be God. And this woman is sitting upon the beast, as we just read here. So that's why it's all in uppercase, because there's a claim here at this point of deity by this beast, and again, the woman associated with the beast. All right, so in verse 5, we learn that the woman has a name written upon her forehead. And here we have our word mystery. So that's why the main reason why we're looking at this passage, because this verse has the word mystery. So the word mystery is the first word in the name of this woman. It's often said, in fact, I just read something this week where someone said that the name of this woman is Mystery Babylon. But that's not quite accurate, because if you notice in verse 5, you have the word mystery, and then you have a comma. So it's a little bit misleading, to say that the name of the woman is Mystery Babylon. There actually are three parts to the name of this woman. So the first part is mystery, the word mystery. The second part is Babylon the Great. And then the third part is the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. So again, I think you probably have all heard and read, again, people talk about Mystery Babylon. And again, it's not a terrible error, but it's slightly misleading. All right, so in this verse again, in Revelation chapter 17 and verse 5, it's again tempting here to interpret the word mystery as meaning something strange and mysterious and spooky. Because when you read about this woman, it certainly upon initial reading, it does seem rather strange. In fact, in the book of Proverbs, this woman is called a strange woman. And it seems kind of mysterious and even spooky. But again, as I've repeated each week, that is never the meaning of the word mystery in the Bible. So in every case, including in this verse, the word mystery means something not previously known, but now revealed. And there are, in fact, a few things about this woman that are first revealed in the book of Revelation. And again, we'll see more of that as we move along in the chapter. But the point now is that the word mystery has the same meaning here as it does every other place in the Bible. So we have to look then for just what is it that is first revealed here about this woman. And we've already mentioned one important revelation in this chapter about this woman, and that is the last verse in chapter 17, where we are told that this woman is that great city. But much of this mystery will be revealed as we move along in this chapter. All right, then again, looking at chapter 17 and verse 5, included in the name of this woman is Babylon the Great. Now, if I were to ask you which city is mentioned most in the Bible, I think you'd probably correctly guess Jerusalem. But many may not know that the city that is mentioned the second most times in the Bible is the city of Babylon. So you really can say that those two cities, Jerusalem and Babylon, those are the two great cities in the Bible. And they are at odds with one another, enemies of one another throughout the Bible, because these two cities represent the two great religions in the Bible and in human history. Look in the book of James, chapter 1. James chapter 1, and Han Hui, would you read verse 27?
James chapter 1, verse 27. Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction and to keep himself unspotted from the world.
So notice the beginning of this verse, it speaks about pure religion. So we often today, correctly, speak of religion as being a bad thing. And I know I and many of you often tell people, I tell people I'm not religious. I hate religion. And that's correctly so. But there is in the Bible one pure religion. And that, of course, is the religion that God gave to the nation of Israel. And we are not a part of that religion today. So So we're not part of this pure religion. And that's why, again, I tell people I'm not religious and I hate religion. But you do in the Bible have this one pure religion given to the nation of Israel. And that pure religion was in the past and will be in the future centered in the city of Jerusalem. But then in contrast to that, we have man's false religion, and man's false religion began in Babylon in the past, and it will again be centered in Babylon in the future. And that's one of the things the book of Revelation is telling us about. Now, we first learn of the founding of this city back in Genesis chapter 10. So let's turn back to Genesis chapter 10. And I want to spend a little time before we conclude today looking at this, looking at and talking about this passage in Genesis chapter 10. So first of all, in Genesis chapter 10, Dennis, would you read verse 8?
Genesis 10:8. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth.
All right, so here it mentions Cush. And Cush was the son of Ham, if you go back a little bit earlier in Genesis. And then also turn to Jeremiah. We're going to come right back to Genesis, but turn to Jeremiah chapter 50. And of course, we already read today in Jeremiah chapter 51. So now Jeremiah chapter 50. And would Dan or Laura read verse 2, chapter 50, verse 2?
Declare ye among the nations, and publish, and set up a standard. Publish, and conceal not. Say, Babylon is taken, Bel is confounded. Merodach is broken in pieces. Her idols are confounded. Her images are broken in pieces.
So notice again here the mention of Babylon. And it also talks about her images, her idols and her images. So it's again regarding idolatry. And then notice it says Bel is confounded. So Cush was also called Bel in ancient times. Okay, then let's go back to Genesis 10. And I should mention briefly before we continue in Genesis 10 that there's a disagreement and a controversy that has gone on for a long time, really, since the Bible was written. And recently, there's been some controversy about this in social media. And the controversy or the question is, how important or necessary, if at all, is it for us as Bible believers to go to secular writings or secular history or archaeology to understand the Bible? And of course, people have different views about that. So I'll tell you very quickly and simply my view about that. And my view is that secular writings and secular history, a knowledge of those things is not necessary to understand the Word of God. I don't believe that secular writings or secular history or secular archaeology explain the Bible to us. On the other hand, I believe the Bible is necessary for us to correctly understand secular writings and history and archaeology and so forth. So that's my view, stated very briefly. And I just want to briefly mention that because we are, in our remaining minutes today, we are going to refer to some things in ancient history that we learn from secular writings. And so again, I don't believe that we have to go to secular writings to understand the Bible, but I believe we have to go to the Bible to understand secular history and writings. And so I don't go to secular writings again to understand the Bible, but I go to the Bible to help me to understand and explain the world around me and past historical things and so forth. So I think that perspective is important. All right, so again, back in Genesis chapter 10, and we're at the moment looking at verse 8. So in addition to, if you glance at verse 7 in Genesis 10, you will see it names some sons of Cush. And so in addition to the sons listed in verse 7, then in verse 8, we are told that that Cush also had a son named Nimrod. And this son, Nimrod, is singled out for special attention. The name Nimrod means to rebel. And certainly that he lived up to his name. So then it says in verse 8 that Nimrod began to be a mighty one in the earth. And certainly a big part of the meaning of him being a mighty one in the earth is that he was a very famous person. He was viewed as being a hero. And in fact, in the Bible, there are several types of the Antichrist, and one of them is Nimrod. And so by studying Nimrod, we can learn a bit about the Antichrist. And of course, the Antichrist also will be a major hero, a major mighty one. Look back in chapter 6 in Genesis. Genesis chapter 6. And Dick, would you read verse 4?
Okay, Genesis 6, verse 4. But unto Cain, excuse me, verse 4, I have trouble with numbers. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock.
Sorry, Dick, chapter 6.
I told you I had trouble with numbers.
Chapter 6 and verse 4.
Well, 4 or 6 was both in there. I just got the order a little wrong here. Okay, now let's try this again.
All right.
Sorry about that. All right, 6 verse 4. And there were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown.
Okay, so notice here that they became mighty men. And we just read in chapter 10 that Nimrod was a mighty one. So this also, I believe, tells us that Nimrod was one of the giants spoken of in the Old Testament. And then look in Isaiah, and then we'll come back to Genesis again. But look in Isaiah chapter 8. Isaiah chapter 8. And Meg, would you read verses 6 through 8 in in Isaiah chapter 8? So Isaiah chapter 8, verses 6 through 8.
For as much as this people refuseth waters of Shiloah that go softly, and rejoice in Rezon and Remaliah's son. Now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria and all his glory. And he shall come up over all his channels and go over all his banks. And he shall pass through Judah. He shall overflow and go over. He shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel.
Okay, there if we start, for example, in the passage we're looking at in Genesis chapter 10, and then begin to trace a number of these things through the Bible, the mighty one, the mighty men, the giants and such, we learn a lot of, we can get a lot of information. And then when we begin to take a look at secular history and religions in the world, I believe it really helps us to understand and explain a lot of what's going on with all of that. So I just want to draw your attention to one thing here in Isaiah 8. If you notice in chapter 8, verse 8, it says, and the stretching out of his wings. So in the Bible, Nimrod's power is also symbolized by wings. And one of the things that this, I think, helps us understand is that there are many ancient drawings in the ancient religions of a bull with wings. And of course, we know that Satan is also associated as being a calf or a bull. And so, again, you'll find a lot of interesting things as you get this information in the Bible and then start looking at the religions in the world, both ancient and modern. So Nimrod, again, became a mighty one. He's a very famous person, a hero. And Nimrod was, in fact, worshipped in a number of places in the world under different names. So, for example, in Egypt, Nimrod became known as Osiris. And then also Nimrod in Greece especially was symbolized with a leopard and a spotted fawn. And so again, all these things you can look at if you're studying the ancient religions and you see all this. And mythology says that Nimrod died a violent death. And then on certain occasions, we learn as we study the ancient Greek religions, the Greeks would tear apart a fawn at a religious festival to commemorate the violent death that Nimrod suffered. And the pagans, in fact, had a number of ceremonies where they would commemorate the violent death of Nimrod. And if you then look in Ezekiel chapter 8, and would Dan or Lisa read verse 14, Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14.
Almost there, Dan. Pages are. All right. Then he brought to me the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat a woman weeping for Tammuz.
Right, so notice in this verse that there's a group of women and they're weeping for Tammuz. And so in the Bible and in secular history again, there are a number of names for Nimrod and religious festivals commemorating his violent death. And so that's what's going on here with the women weeping for Tammuz. Also, Bacchus is another name for Nimrod. So in Egypt and Assyria and Greece and Babylon, this god Nimrod, again under different names at different places, was also often portrayed as a child in the arms of a goddess mother. And that might make you think of something. All right, back to Genesis chapter 10. Genesis chapter 10 and verse 9, again speaking about Nimrod, it says that he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now, after the flood, there's often a question about dinosaurs. Was there ever such a thing as dinosaurs? And if so, what happened to them, and so forth. So I believe certainly that what we now call dinosaurs, many of them did exist. Some of them are become very mythological, and I think as far as exactly what the animal looked like and acted like, and some of that is kind of imagination. But the fact that I don't question that there were huge animals such as we would now call dinosaurs. And then there's questions about what happened to them. And one of the common theories is that a meteor struck the earth and destroyed them. I believe there were two things that in effect got rid of these animals or dinosaurs from the earth. One is that in the flood in the days of Noah, there were great atmospheric changes that took place. And I think probably some of them didn't do well with the new atmosphere after the flood. But also after the flood, I believe there still were many huge animals. And that now became a problem. It was not a problem earlier, but now it became a problem. If you look in chapter 9 of Genesis, and beginning in verse 2, so this is after the flood, and it says in verse 2, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every fowl of the air, upon all that moveth upon the earth, and upon all the fishes of the sea. Into your hand are they delivered. Every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. So after the flood in particular, there is now a very antagonistic relationship between humans and these huge animals, these dinosaurs, and of course within the animal kingdom itself. So when they got off the ark after the flood, wild animals were a big danger to humans. And so I believe that's part of what is referred to in Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 and 9, that Nimrod was literally a mighty hunter, in the sense that he was a hero for his ability to kill these animals, these dinosaurs, and to protect people by slaying the dinosaurs. And I believe there also were dragons at that time. And again, they may not be exactly what we see as dragons now in movies or cartoons or something. But I believe there was something similar to that existed back at this time. And that Nimrod, again, was a mighty hunter of such things. And that largely is what led to his fame. Okay, then in verse 10, notice again, it says, Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. Now that phrase, before the Lord, you might think that sounds like a good thing, but turn back to chapter 6 in Genesis.
You were just, what verse were you on just now?
Chapter 10, verse 9.
In Revelation?
Genesis.
10:9.
Yeah. So turn back to chapter 6 for a moment and look at verse 11. It says, the earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So my point in this verse is that phrase before God or before the Lord is not necessarily a good thing. Clearly here in chapter 6, verse 11, it's a bad thing. Man was corrupt before the Lord. So it's there's much that we could talk about regarding this, but it's about time to conclude for today. So in ancient writings, by the way, Nimrod is also associated with the constellation Orion, which is the constellation, the mighty hunter. But then let me conclude today by, in Genesis chapter 10 and verse 10, it says, "And the beginning of his kingdom," Nimrod's kingdom, "was Babel, and Erech and Akkad and Calneh in the land of Shinar." So this is the beginning of the city of Babylon in the Bible. And so this gives you, there's again a lot more we could talk about here, but this gives you a little bit of the flavor of the beginning of the city of Babylon in the Bible. And as we've seen, this goes all the way through the Bible until in the end times, it's that great city, the woman. All right, so we will stop there for today. And again, next time we'll be looking more at these things in Revelation 17 as we look at the last time in the Bible that we find the word mystery. So thank you all.
Thank you, Dan.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, Jean.
Good night, Meg and everybody.
Bye all.
Screens.